I'll speed up my answer.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Predictive Analytics Podcast. I'm joined today by Chris Allen. Chris, how goes it?
It's going great. Like we were talking shortly before the show. Shortly after the Thanksgiving timeframe, I'm just kind of sliding into the back end of the season. Hopefully, some folks have some stuff to fight for regarding their fantasy playoff picture. Unfortunately for me, I got knocked out of the Scott Fish Bowl. Couldn't make it into the playoffs for this year. But other than that, I'm happy to be able to sit down and talk with you today.
I'm happy to talk with you too. So let's dive right in. So this season's been full of parity. Top teams losing to bad teams. Everything's been thrown into total chaos. And we say this every year. But this year feels like it's something special. So in this season of craziness, what have been some of the lessons that we've learned as a fantasy community this season, or even that you've learned?
I think that one of the things that I've learned is being able to really try and adjust as things change for each team. I start to either figure out who they are as a team, or even how teams are, like opposing teams are approaching them, like from a defensive standpoint. I try and look at it as a season within a season. And one of the examples that comes to mind are the Cincinnati Bengals, where during the first few weeks of the season, they come out bottom 10 in terms of pass rate over expectation. Actually, even worse than that. I think they were bottom 5 in terms of pass rate over expectation. We see more of Joe Mixon being involved, but then things start to connect. After like week 3, week 4, we see Joe Burrow starting to connect with Jamar Chase on those deep passes. We think the Bengals passing offense is back, or at the very least, they've solved some of their issues. Their offensive line is starting to look great, but then they have another season change where the wheels start to come off, especially once they face the Jets. They have those 2 back-to-back losses before they head into their bye, and they have to do a little bit of soul searching. And now coming out of their bye, at least I thought they looked okay over the past couple of weeks. The final score in their last game against the Chargers, I don't really think completely contextualizes how they actually looked from an offensive standpoint, but things have started to change for them, and they've changed for a number of other teams as well. Kansas City, and how teams have approached them using more too high coverage against them. Even for Dallas, not necessarily being the passing juggernaut that we thought they were going to be, or what they showed through the first 5 or 6 weeks before Dak went down. They've been more of a balanced approach, with Dak still kind of not necessarily nursing the ankle injury, but also dealing with other ailments as well. He was coming into the season with the shoulder or labrum problem as well. So teams having to figure out who they are on offense, and also how opposing teams are interacting with them, has been one of the biggest takeaways that I've taken from this season. And then, of course, having to adjust from that as the weeks continue on.
Yes. So how would you try to leverage that into drafting for next season, whether it be best ball, because I know you do a lot of that, you do a lot of dynasty, you do redraft. How would you try to leverage that?
So all of that information, especially like the one area of fantasy football that I typically try and focus on, is the quarterback position, or the passing game. It's not just because it's more efficient than the running game. It's just one aspect of football in and of itself that's really been the biggest interest of me, whether it be quarterbacks, wide receivers. I've talked with Matt Harmon, who's the proprietor of Reception Perception, a number of times. And so I just love watching that part of the game. So for wide receivers, really looking at their opportunity, and not just the targets, right? Not just the targets, the yards, the touchdowns, not just the stuff that you can get from Pro Football Reference, but trying to dig a bit deeper into what their opportunity is from a week-to-week standpoint, whether you're looking at not just their targets, but their targets per route run, which can give them some sort of idea of the team's intent on when they're out in the field, how often are they getting targeted. Also their air yards. That's something from Josh Hermsmeyer, looking at what the team's intent is from a depth perception, that they're actually being targeted on like some deeper routes, and also how much of the team's air yards is either one player or a couple of players actually getting from a week-to-week standpoint, which helped me at least continue to be confident in T. Higgins' opportunity after he was starting to look like, maybe at best a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 towards the middle parts of the season. But it's things like that where you use some of the underlying metrics that a lot of folks have used. If you're looking at Pro Football Focus, Sports Info Solutions, a lot of those folks like have that data available to you. But using that information, it allows you to leverage what the casual folks or what the general market thinks about some of those players. So like I mentioned with T. Higgins, it was like through weeks 5 through 8, where he was getting those 6 for 60, 7 for 80, not finding the paint. I mean, those types of weeks, it became difficult for a lot of folks to continue to click on his name, whether it's for daily fantasy. I think for season-long perspective, you're probably starting him week in and week out anyway because you didn't have better options. But for daily fantasy, it became tough to continue to start him week in and week out, regardless of what his price was. But looking at his opportunity, looking at his air yard share, at least it should have given us some confidence to continue starting him. And lo and behold, he's now overtaken his teammate Jamar Chase in terms of the opportunity within the offense, scored, got over the 100-yard mark over the past like couple of games. So we've seen that type of using that type of information allow us to make better decisions, and it's paid off in a big way, especially for T. Higgins. So at least those are the things that I try and look at. And if you do that, that's what allows you to try and leverage the field in front of, like in terms of trying to at least make better decisions than what just anybody just casually looking at box scores might do.
So you're saying the air yards, market share, all of those are very sticky stats to take into next season. Definitely look at those compared to like targets, because correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like targets changes year in and year out way more than we give it credit for. So much changes with targets. You can bring in a third string tight end. He'll take up 10, 15 targets. That's 2 or 3 from, I don't know, whoever's their number one receiver is. And then you bring in like 2 or 3 of those. You bring in a third string running back that catches 4 screen passes. You bring in a bunch of those, and you slowly start to see those targets go down. Much less if you bring in a new quarterback, new wide receiver, new tight end, new running back. It can change so much. So the air yards does bring in a lot, though.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly how folks should look at it. Because if we think about a guy like, and again, just sticking on the Cincinnati Bengals thing, since that's my team, think about a guy like Tyler Boyd. He looked like coming into this season, he would be the value pick in that offense. He would be the guy that if you wanted to draft anybody from the Bengals just based off of his ADP, he would come at the best value, because it was Jamar that was typically drafted earliest, and let's say like, 4th-ish round. T. Higgins coming shortly after that in the 4th, 5th round, but Tyler Boyd 6th, 7th, 8th round, and he would look like a value based off of the assumption that we had about the offense. They would still be pass heavy. If the volume was going to continue to be there from a macro standpoint, Boyd should continue to get his. But after the first couple of weeks, it became clear that this was going to be an even more concentrated offense with a smaller volume or smaller amount of air yards to go around to all of their pass catchers. And so from there, we had to quickly adjust to what this new offense was going to look like. And without having the volume that Tyler Boyd had typically had in seasons past, I mean, heck, he was coming off of a 150 target season. So without seeing that similar type of opportunity for him, it becomes difficult to continue to roster him, or at least rely on him from a fantasy standpoint as we previously had. So yes, I 100% agree. Trying to look at like that sort of opportunity from a year in, year out basis, and then trying to at least not necessarily quantify, but at least be somewhat open-minded to how offenses can change year over year, where adding a guy like Jamar Chase is going to take away targets from any particular player. Or let's see, even like talking about one of the teams that's playing tonight in the Minnesota Vikings, where you have incoming players, or at least upcoming players like Tyler Conklin coming into that offense. You add other guys like KJ Osborne in that offense. So while it's even a concentrated offense, you can still see at least a guy like KJ Osborne taking a few targets away from somebody like Justin Jefferson, which happened earlier in the season. So it's just stuff like that that you at least have to account for. It might not make a massive difference from a holistic standpoint or from a seasonal standpoint, but from a week-to-week standpoint, since fantasy football is a week-to-week game, those are the things that we should be accounting for.
Yes. One of the stats that I use that's sticky year over year, at least if you have a couple year sample size, is touchdown percentage. You look at guys, Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, Derrick Henry, Adam Thielen. They consistently have super high touchdown percentages. And that's because they're getting a ton of opportunities in the red zone. And year in and year out, fantasy analysts will tell you, oh, you can't trust their touch. They're way too efficient last season. They're way too efficient the past 3 seasons. It's just the way they roll. roll. Don't try to outsmart yourself and go with the value pick. Touchdown percentage works. There's a reason we're charting it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you just use that particular number, sure, I think you could probably send up some red flags like here and there. I think it was a couple of seasons ago. It was before Antonio Brown left the Steelers. I mean, his touchdown percentage, at least compared to the rest of the receivers that were currently with Pittsburgh, because that back then you still had, I mean, Juju was still, I mean, like pretty much like, I think he's still in his prime. I mean, he's still fairly young, but still you had Juju there. I mean, you had other options within that passing offense that didn't necessarily say that Antonio Brown was not only going to continue scoring touchdowns, but also have the requisite targets within the Steelers offense to at least put him in a position to buoy his fantasy production if the touchdowns weren't there. So he was one of the guys that I had marked down as a kind of a red flag if I wanted to draft him in the following season, just for that particular fact, that if you're not going to have the targets, if you're not going to continue to see any of this, like the baseline opportunity, then we can't continue to rely on players like that. So no, I 100% agree that like that value on its own, like that should be at least somewhat taken into account. But then if you then start to stack up that along with, like we were talking about earlier, the targets, the routes run, the air yards and all that, it gives you a more complete picture of the receiver themselves, and you can make a more educated decision based off of that.
Yeah, you brought up a great point on that. It does send up a bunch of red flags. I don't think anybody was coming into this season expecting Robert Tonyan to put up another 11 touchdowns off of like 50 catches or targets. No one's going to expect, in their right mind's going to expect that again. And Rodgers just had a crazy season, one of the best that we've seen ever.
MVP season.
Yeah. Apparently it's the best one in the league.
Yeah.
But you're bringing up Juju Smith-Schuster and a bunch of 1B options. They haven't really panned out too well the past couple of years, especially in terms of value. A lot of people are trying to outsmart themselves, drafting Amari Cooper instead of CeeDee Lamb because he was a round later, Julio Jones instead of AJ Brown because he was 2 or 3 rounds later, Tyler Lockett instead of DK Metcalf because he was 2 or 3 rounds later. Mm-hmm. And they have not panned out near as well as if you paid premium for the top receiver, just because those guys were premium for a reason. There's a reason we're drafting them that high. They are consistent producers. They usually have really good quarterback play, and they will usually put up a ton of fantasy points.
Yeah, and I think that's the tough part that most folks don't always want to, I guess, account for. It's just, oh, well, I'm not going to pay for X receiver because I can arbitrage some of their production with the receiver in that same offense, so however many rounds later. And in some cases, that might work, right? In offenses that are fairly concentrated. So let's say at the start of the season, if you are rostering DK Metcalf and then, if you had an opponent that was rostering Tyler Lockett, who knows? I mean, on a week-to-week standpoint, you might have been able to get 8 for 100 out of DK Metcalf, and the very next week, Tyler Lockett does his Tyler Lockett thing where he catches 4 balls for 125 yards and a touchdown. It's entirely possible, but the Seahawks aren't the same as every other offense. It's not like I'm going to sit there and say that, well, I'm not going to draft Tyreek Hill because I'm just going to go ahead and draft Demarcus Robinson in like the 15th or 16th round. Doesn't work that way. I'm not going to draft Devontae Adams. I'm just going to draft Allen Lazard or Marquez Valdes-Scantling in the 10th, 11th, or 12th round. Doesn't work that way. It's just trying to understand that offense as a whole, not just saying that, well, I'm just going to take this receiver because his teammate is going X rounds earlier. I mean, that's not really how we calculate value. It's what that receiver's opportunity or weekly opportunity is going to be that really helps harness or better help us better understand what their value is to their team. And if they do have at least similar value to their team, like a Tyler Lockett to the Seahawks, or even if we're thinking about other wide receivers that were typically taken in the middle rounds this year, so like a T. Higgins to the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, those guys, okay, now we're talking, but always trying to bypass like the alpha within any offense just because the cost is too high. I mean, that's where you'll wind up like injecting too much volatility in your lineup, and you can wind up making a roster where, sure, it might work for a while. You might wind up with a few good games where, you might wind up being the guy that scores the most points, but at the same time, you open yourself up to a number of floor games where those targets aren't there, or those yards aren't there, or those touchdowns aren't there. And so that's where you need to at least exercise some sort of balance when you're building your roster, so that you can weather some of those, valley or floor games with other games that might putting you over the top for that week.
You cannot make a roster of Deshaun Jacksons and expect you to pop off every week.
It might look good for 1 week. That's about it.
My dad always brings up the Vincent Jackson, how he would have 3 huge games and then be silent for the other 13, but you had to start him every week.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot how Tyler Lockett's been this year. He's had like 3 or 4 really, really good games, including 2 to start the season. Mm-hmm. Then he's not done much of anything since. And part of that has to do with Geno Smith starting versus Russell Wilson. And that's part of the stuff that you have to quantify, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there are a number of good analysts that try and break down what a wide receiver's value is to their particular team. I know that Sam Hoppen, that I work with over at 444, he's our director of analytics over there. He actually puts together a weekly chart. If it's not weekly, then I think he does it maybe in like quarters of the season or something like that, that kind of outlines how many targets the top trio or top duo of each team winds up getting, and how much they account for in that offense, so that you can really see, all right, so it really is like Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and maybe a little bit of Tyler Boyd, like they are critical parts of their passing offense. Or maybe even, how much Devontae Adams is like versus Alan Lazard and like Marcus Valdes-Scantling. So you can better quantify, or at least from a visual standpoint, you can see how much, like what the size of that each player's chunk is like to their offense. And so we really can't just say, well, like I was saying earlier, I'm not going to draft this guy in the first few rounds. I'm just going to get his teammate later, where that value discrepancy, like there's a reason why some of these guys are being drafted later. And then we should try and account for that just based off of just looking at their ADP.
I love that phrase, value discrepancy. I'm going to have to borrow that / steal it. But another position where I think that's most prevalent, you could argue quarterback. Not many analysts are going to try to argue quarterbacks. They're always going to say punt until the 10th round, draft Jalen Hurts. Well, yeah. Running backs, they're going to tell you to buy premium, but there are some steals that you can get. Mm-hmm. Tight ends, not so much. You're looking at a top 2, 3, 4, or 5, maybe, if you're really going to have the guts to do that. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, I almost prefer streaming than starting Dallas Goedert, TJ Hawkinson, Noah Fant.
Yeah, and I hate the fact that every year we wind up coming into the season thinking that there's like a little bit of depth at the position. It's almost every year we're just like, yeah, of course you got your guys up at the top. You've got your Travis Kelce's, you've got your George Kittles, throw in Waller, Andrews. And then, of course, like this past year, we've had the whole debate surrounding like Kyle Pitts. So it's like a top 5, like top 6 when it comes to tight end position. But then there's always those fringe guys that's just, you almost have to draft them, but you won't feel great about it. Like Noah Fant or Robert Tonyan or Logan Thomas or Dallas Goedert, Mike Gesicki. It's just like all of these guys. It's like you talk yourself into it, but you're never really confident in it. You're never confident that, oh yeah, like I've got Tyler Higbee. I'm good. I'm solid at the tight end position. Like you never feel great about it. So I think I've always tried to go around I've been of the mind when I'm building teams that unless I'm going to get those guys in the first, tight end 1 through 6, and I'm not really all that, I guess, interested in, or I guess I'm not really all that confident in one versus the other, except for Travis Kelce, but even that hasn't been the case like this past year. But it's just trying to find like one of those guys makes the most sense, because afterwards it's each week. Who are you gonna feel the best about trying to start, and are they even going to be available? So from a week-to-week standpoint, sure, give me those guys that I'll at least put them in my lineup with the confidence there to get 4, 5, 6 targets. But outside of that, I have zero confidence in what the outcome is going to be. So I think that makes them, at least from a tight end perspective, yeah, it's always going to be a tough ask for any of us to try and figure out which one to start. But at least we have some sense of who the right guys are. But it's just every year it just winds up being absolute chaos and a dumpster fire shortly afterwards.
Yes. The only late round tight end from this past year that I can think has panned out has been healthy Rob Gronkowski. Whenever he's healthy, I think he's had 3 games of double-digit touchdown, not double digits, but multiple touchdowns. I don't can't think of any other tight end that's had 3 of those, except for maybe Dawson Knox. I think he has at least 2.
Yeah, and he essentially came out of nowhere. I know that during his time in college, he essentially was used as a pass catcher. But if I'm remembering correctly, like he went to Ole Miss and he was like
Yes.
a part of like that team that featured what was it like DK Metcalf and like some of those other like big name wide receivers.
AJ
So
Brown.
yeah, AJ Brown. So like he essentially was like the fourth, fifth option on that team. So I really never really knew about his ability to be a pass catching tight end until about this year, right? But for Rob Gronkowski, it is just it's hilarious to me that after taking an entire season off, we essentially like all the injuries that he's battled throughout his career, for him to come back and play at the level that he's playing at, and not just as a pass catcher. Of course, that's the thing that we always talk about from a fantasy perspective, is that seeing him what he had like the touchdown this past week, but just seeing him continually wind up being that guy for Tom Brady. It's just hilarious to me to think about. He didn't even have to do this. He could have just stayed retired and walked into Canton within the next few years without any sort of argument. First ballot Hall of Famer without a doubt, not just as a receiver, but as a blocker. And of course, all the accolades that come with being attached to that Patriots franchise for the run that they've had. But now to see him come back at his age and still continue to pull away from cornerbacks on routes, still be in just a tremendous blocker. I mean, it's just I don't like he is a once in a lifetime or like once in a generation like type of player, and it's going to be tough like not seeing him on the field like whenever he does try to hang him up again for good. But to see him do what he does now, it's unreal to me.
The other thing that you did bring up was I'm pretty sure Gronk was not doing the Tom Brady diet when he was for his year away. I am pretty sure, knowing him, he was partying, trying to have the best time he could. And then he comes in, no beer belly, no nothing. Scores
Uh-huh.
2 touchdowns opening night. It's just crazy to me.
Yeah, that's just, I mean, get on out of here with it. I mean, it's not fair for not just one guy on that team to be just completely defying father time, like with Tom Brady at 44 years old, on pace for, I believe, like 5,400 passing yards and just short of 50 touchdowns at 44 years old. Why? And also to have his old teammate, Rob Gronkowski, another cyborg apparently, to be able to do the exact same thing. It's just, I mean, the league should just go ahead and just give them give them the Lombardi trophy and just tell them, it's like, here, just take it and retire. And let's let other people enjoy, be having a chance at winning a Super Bowl, because otherwise it's just not fair.
It's one of those things whenever you and your old friends go back to your old elementary or middle school and they all ask you if you want to play a pickup game, and then the PE
Mhm.
teacher yells at you to get off the court, just give it to them.
Right.
Kind of
Yeah.
what it
It's
reminds
just
me of.
yeah, just give it to them and let's just all go home. Until they decide to leave, let's just all go home.
Yeah. But one last tight end thought. I am not 100% sure Travis Kelce is our tight end 1 going into next season. For me, there's a debate for even Mark Andrews, just because as Patrick Mahomes really shown that he's the best quarterback right now, he's not playing too well. Neither is Lamar. But Kelsey's hit that. I don't know if Kelsey's hit that age cliff, and that's part of the reason why Mahomes is declining. But I'd almost rather have Andrews, just because I trust the volume that's going to be there. I know that he's not hitting an age wall, and he's been very, very durable.
That's true, at least from an age perspective. I don't know about Travis Kelce not being like the tight end 1 like next season. I don't know about if it's the age wall. I just think there's something going on with the Chiefs offense that we just don't know. Well, I can at least opine on it, where it's part of the fact that the Chiefs want to play a specific way, the way that they have for the past few seasons since Mahomes came up, like basically came onto the league and said, yeah, I'm going to be the QB1 in this league from here on out. And there's nothing you can do about it. Well, teams figured out that you can do something about it. But the problem is that Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, they're still stuck in 2020 and 2019, where we're just going to continue to have these 5-6 play drives that will last less than a minute, where Patrick Mahomes is dropping back, doing his little scramble out of the pocket, and then hitting Tyreek Hill for 20 yards, or hitting Travis Kelce out of that 3-by-1 ISO formation where Travis Kelce runs that 10-15 yard curl route and he hits him for another chunk gain. It's just, that's not working. And it's not to say that it will never work again. It's just that Reid and Mahomes need to come to at least an agreement that they need to try other things. And it's not necessarily running the ball. I'm not advocating for just, run the ball or anything like that, but incorporating the other elements of their offense. And I'm also not saying that they need to incorporate Demarcus Robinson or Byron Pringle or Josh Gordon, but they do have, at least if I'm remembering correctly, they do have a pass catching running back out of LSU who that was his calling card coming out of college that they're not passing to. And even still, they do have another pass catching running back who's a little bit older in Darrell Williams that they could also use. I mean, they spent so much of their offseason revamping that offensive line, making massive trades and signings in order to boost that offensive line, that this shouldn't be much of an issue for them. So my thought going into this year was that they could be more of a balanced team. And again, not balanced saying that they run more. It's just incorporating the other pieces of their offense outside of Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. So until they do that, I just think that this is what we're going to see out of the Chiefs offense. And I don't think it's at least I'm less inclined to believe it's an age thing. I just think it's Mahomes wants to be what Mahomes was in the years prior, where he's going to use his arm and he's going to use Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce to beat other teams to death. And teams have just told them that no, because we can watch you with these too high shells that they're running, too high coverage that they're running, and we can limit the deep shots in that way by not sending as much pressure and just dropping more guys into coverage. And the fact that they're still getting home is another problem in and of itself. So they're not taking the layups. The Chiefs aren't taking the layups, and they're getting frustrated by the fact that they're unable to play like they did beforehand. My hope is that once they adjust and once they figure out, I'll just throw a dump off or a screen to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, maybe a short pass and get yards after the catch, then they can start to function as they were beforehand. But until that happens, I think they're kind of stuck in a rut.
That's part of what's made Tom Brady so good. Name a defense that stops him. You can't. He's beaten every single one. And until Mahomes beats that double high shell consistently enough to get him out of it, it's hard to put Mahomes in front of Brady, at least as the best quarterback in the league.
Agree.
Well, Chris, I appreciate you coming on this show. Thank you for coming on. Where can anybody find your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Chris Allen FFWX. I contribute to a few sites. My home is over at 4for4 Football. I write multiple columns over there each week, but I also do shows over at Football Guys with Sigmund Bloom and the rest of the guys there. And I also write a weekly column for NBC Sports Edge that should be actually dropped earlier today. So a few different places to find me, but you can always find me on Twitter as well.
Thank you, Chris. See you later.
Anytime.